Welcome to this video overview of my policy assignment in Education 9200. I'm going to provide just a basic overview of the Higher Education Act, or the Higher Education Opportunity Act, as well as the answers to the two questions that were in the assignment. So the Higher Education Opportunity Act is actually the newest version of the Higher Education Act of 1965. So it basically came in with the understanding of how do we create a system and some legislation to really provide a better framework for students to be able to have access to higher education. So the basic tenets of the Act in 1965 where there were 6 titles. There are more now, just as legislation has changed and things have been added or amended. But in 1965, these were the 6 the titles that were there. The first one was to provide funding for basically the extension or continuation of continuing education programs. Title II was to allocate funds to increase libraries and help employ qualified librarians in those institutions and in those libraries. Title III was to help strengthen the developing institutions, so that those institutions that had not yet met accreditation but were on the verge of doing that. How did we help them get to that point? Title IV was supporting the undergraduate scholarships, talking about financial aid, giving loans for a reduced interest rate so that it wasn't necessarily so difficult for students to be able to repay those, and also helping with work-study programs and the availability of those programs. Title V was talking about the improvements in the quality of teaching, so teachers and professors that were at universities were more highly qualified, which provided a better avenue of education for the students. And then Title VI was the financial assistance to basically undergraduate education. There's some really great analysis of the Higher Education Act. Here's our 2 links basically that will take you to really great resources, kind of an overview of the actual act itself, which I felt and thought was really, really helpful. So the act today really does a number of different things. There's a lot of different tenets that kind of go into what it is and how it's formulated. So the new provisions or the new titles that are in there, Title I basically establishes this provision of the law, and it defines colleges as basically being degree-seeking institutions. It talks about gainful employment, regulations, and the reporting requirements for colleges and universities. So that is what Title I has morphed into more recently with HEOA of 2011. Title II talks about the teacher quality enhancement facilities. So it really talks about how do we provide quality teachers and regulate that. Institutional aid, how do we help teachers become better? There are grant opportunities that are kind of woven into that. So that is really what Title II is. Title III is all about institutional aid. So it talks about the specific categories that revolve around colleges and universities. So aid for minority students, STEM support, a couple of different things like that kind of fall into that institutional aid piece. Title IV is all about student assistance. So this is where federal loans, the Pell Grants, direct loans, different things like that are kind of tied into Title IV, and it's a huge title. There's so many different facets of financial aid that go into that. Title V is about, again, the developing of institutions. So how do we bring institutions up to par if they're not necessarily on accreditation or they need to be? How do we help them do that? Also authorizes funding for different opportunities for different programs. So deserving programs or Hispanic programs. Also talking about really bringing in the Hispanic element. So talking about how do we do those different things. Title VI is an area of international education programs. So we're talking more about the specific geographic regions and talking about how do we create these national resource centers to teach culture of countries around the world. The university that I graduated from for my undergraduate degree was actually working with a provision of Title VI to bring in more students of different countries to be able to explain and talk about those places around the world, to build a really big culture and really showcase that the world is a lot bigger than we all kind of tend to make it at times. Title VII is about graduate and post-secondary improvement programs. So this one is talking about the programs that allow federal funding for the improvement of those graduate and post-secondary programs, especially with regards to students with disabilities. Title VIII it's kind of a subsidy of additional programs. It authorizes higher education programs to talk about like post-grad programs, math and science scholarship programs, business workforce and job skill training, Teach for America, and there's a couple of other things that are kind of woven into basically what Title VIII is. Title IX it authorizes the additional programs such as United States Institute of Peace. This one has programs to assist deaf students. There's a couple of other foreign language and international studies programs that are kind of woven into basically what Title IX is. Also, this one talks about the tribal control colleges and how they are allowed and how they work in cooperation with the university system as a whole. Title X talks about private student loan improvements and how those things are utilized within higher education. And then Title XI is how institutes of higher education report and study different things and how that information is kind of pushed back to the federal government. So the first question that deals with our assignment is how might these policies that have been formulated, how might these policies have been formulated differently in a tightly coupled system? I really wanted to understand what a tightly coupled system was, so I did some research, and the definition that I found on dictionary.com was that coupling was basically the degree of direct knowledge that one element has of another, so how they're kind of interconnected or that connectivity. If a system is loosely coupled, that's an approach to taking something, those interconnecting components in a system, and having them connect, but at the least extent possible. So very loosely, again, not to use a term to define a term, using that coupling, so they're tied together with as little as possible. And a tightly coupled is when they're very highly dependent on one another. So going back to the question is how might these policies have been formulated if they were formulated in a tightly coupled system? To me, if we're looking at a reformation of an act, or we're looking at reformatting legislation, we really have to take a look at how those policies interact with each other and how they affect the greater good or the broader good for a better understanding of why they need to work better. In order for them to function differently, we have to look at it from the aspect of that these elements are not just loosely strung together to where they kind of affect one another, but that they are all very connected and they're highly connected, and when one thing changes, it does affect drastically the other elements that are connected to it. So for example, when there's reformatting of financial aid legislation, that directly affects how colleges and universities are run and what they can and cannot do with the funds that are given to them. However, in the event that students are not able to qualify for financial aid, or that financial aid is so expensive for them to be able to take out loans for repayment purposes, that also directly affects what colleges and universities are able to do, and students are able to do when they come to the college and university. So it's this very double-edged sword. And we all need to kind of gravitate to the understanding that these are very tightly coupled, and they're not loosely coupled. They all affect each other in some form or fashion, not just on a small scale, but on a very large scale. Even if they're broadly connected, between the different titles that are in the legislation, they're still very tightly coupled. I think if we think of it as anything else, we're doing it a disservice right away. The second question here is, how do symbols, language, and the media roles influence the ways in which these policies are understood by the public? This one I really felt was so pertinent to what it is that's going on today, as well as the question before that. Even if you look at what some of the candidates for that are running for president are toting on some of their platforms about a free higher education, the thing that people don't understand is that it's not free. It may be free for you to go to that university, but it's not free. Someone has to pay those educators' salaries. Somebody has to pay to keep the lights on. Somebody has to pay to keep those programs running. Somebody has to pay to do all of those things. You may be getting it free while you're there, but when you get out, you are going to invest into that same system that you got for free. So it's not free, whether or not you have to take out loans for it, or whether the federal government subsidizes it and it pays for it, and you don't ever have to feel like you quote unquote pay anything out of pocket. You will pay for it at some point in time. There's no two ways about it. Everyone is going to have to pay either into that pot, so to speak, to make sure that works. And that's why I think we need to formulate our theories and thoughts about what we're talking about, not as though they are loosely coupled, but that they are very tightly coupled together. Because I think if we start to think about those things in that area and in that light, we'll be able to change how we think about them and how we can change those things for the better without looking at I want to get this for free, I don't want to pay for it, quote unquote, type of a system. Getting back to the question at hand, how does the media now influence that? So let me segue those two thoughts together. I really feel like social media, especially media in general, has the ability to influence the way policies are understood by the public. If you look at the understanding of Common Core, and you look at how the perception of what that has kind of rolled out to be, I think that media in general has played such a huge part in how that has been perceived and received. I think that if people really knew the tenets of what Common Core was meant to do and is meant to do in the education system, that they would probably gravitate to more of an understanding of acceptance instead of total rejection. Or you would see where people are so frustrated with the system that they just want to blast it on social media or on the news or however it is, because it's not working, or it's hard for this student or it's hard for that student. When you totally reformat how your education system is working in hopes to try to make things better, you can't please everybody. But media has such a strong role in that perception that not only do people gravitate to that, but it's very easy to jump off and on a bandwagon when things are going well or things are going poorly. One of the graphics here, as you can see, the one that's up in the top right hand corner, it says media, and then there's the word education. But there's a few words in here that I thought were very interesting. You talk about activism, you talk about reform, talk about teaching, citizens, world, approach. All of those, there's some bigger words that are in there in that word blog. And it's interesting because the way media perceives education, there's a lot of reform that it talks about. There's a lot of different approaches that need to be done. There's a lot of look at the world, look at how the United States is so far behind. All of those things influence how people in this country look at laws and legislation and how we're trying to make things better. Now, I'm not here to say that what we've done has worked spectacularly, because I think that all of us can agree that there is room for improvement. However, I don't think that with the way media portrays it now, that it's really as bad as it is. And I do think that the fact that we have access to media in our classrooms all day, every day, where if a teacher says something wrong or something happens in a classroom, not only is it put up on social media, but it's blasted across every news outlet. And before long, education looks even worse in this country than it did, 10 seconds ago. So I really do feel going back to this question of how does the media influence those? It really, really influences those in a major way. And if we look back at Fowler's chapter in chapter 6, he's talking about the media on page, I believe it's 139, and he talks about the mass media being all of these different services and entities, but he says, their part in this is an important part of the process because they have this ability to consciously or unconsciously basically contextualize the stance of whatever it is that we're supposedly supposed to take a stand on, whether that be for or against something. They really have the ability to change the way that we think about something. And it might not even be because it's based on what we feel. It's just based on what it is that we hear or what it is that we see. So media, much like newspapers were not that long ago, really have a huge ability to change the perception of what it is that we think, feel, and how we act towards a specific piece of legislation, or in this case, education, and possibly a piece of education legislation that is going to be reformed. In case you're curious, these are my references that I used to find a lot of the information that I used here in this presentation. Thank you very much, and hope you enjoyed.